A seamstress named Amira, hired for an opulent charity gala, is mocked into playing the piano as a prank by an entitled guest. What begins as humiliation becomes a revelation. Her music, born of stolen moments at a broken upright and taught by a stubborn old teacher, reaches into the gilded room and strips it bare. The performance unmakes petty cruelties, awakens buried griefs, and forces a reckoning for everyone present. Cinematic and emotionally charged, this story follows Amira's rise from anonymity to unexpected power, exploring themes of dignity, class, redemption, and the quiet courage it takes to claim one's voice. It is at once a portrait of a simple woman's inner life and a study of a society that mistakes loud wealth for worth. The chandelier hung like a frozen tide at the center of the Mercer's salon, its crystal teeth catching the light and spelling out small, precise promises of wealth. Around it, guests moved as if through a portrait. Gowns stitched with glass, colognes engineered to be remembered, laughter clipped and practiced. Servants threaded between chairs like ghosts in gray, replacing champagne flutes before they had a chance to empty. Amira stood against the blue silk of a curtained alcove with a spool of thread tangled around one wrist, a measuring tape looped like a scarf, and the hem of a dress bunched in her hands. She had come because money had urgency. 3 weeks of delays meant the dress would not be finished without her. Mending for the Mercer's gala paid more in one evening than she made in a month at the tailoring house, and people who lived in small rooms learned to measure their days by the opportunities they could fold into them. Amira's fingers knew how to coax fabric into something better, how to make a sleeve sit the way it wanted to, how to hide a seam so well it was ashamed to be noticed. That evening, the dress was a constellation of silvery thread, perfect until a seam gave like a small betrayal on the right side. Double-stitched the bias here, called a woman whose diamond clipped the shoulder of another woman like punctuation. Amira bowed her head and worked. Her world was a series of small corrections: fit the dot, lower the waist, press the collar flat. She measured and sewed in silence, because silence was efficient and allowed the other things to exist. The sound of the city at night beyond the salon windows, the hum of hot irons miles away, the memory of a piano. The memory arrived like a scent: waxed wood, the soft give of black keys, the faint dust of old music paper. Amira's mother had died when she was small. There had been no room for instruments in their house, not in the way there was room for a dinner table or the single bed in the corner. But across the alley was an old mosque with a tiny room for music lessons, and a man called Mr. Kadim who taught piano there after evening services. He was a grizzled thing, all elbows and gentleness, with a beard like a manuscript. He taught anyone who had a coin and the stubbornness to show up. Amira had saved for weeks to pay him, stealing sugar and tea from the markets, trading small mending favors for lessons, learning to call notes by their names until they lived in her hands like neighbors. Music, she discovered, had a way of making her house bigger. "What's your name?" asked one of the Mercer girls now, doing her homework with another seamstress's silence, circling the seam as if it were evidence instead of needlework. "Amira," she said. "Ah," the girl said, as if that solved whatever equation brought a seamstress into a ballroom. "You sew for the tailor's house? I saw you earlier. You have ink on your thumb." That was the sort of attention Amira knew how to wear, small, not meant to linger. She kept sewing until a tall boy in a velvet jacket, Marcus Mercer's cousin, she learned later, pushed through the crowd, the sort of young man who had been bred to fill silence with remarks. He carried a paper cup of coffee like a prop. "Who's that?" Marcus asked, voice well practiced for indifference. "Amira," the seamstress said. The word fell like a closed window. Marcus took the hem from her, just for a single, insolent second, and pretended to study it. "You play?" he asked, as if the question were an impossible coin, meant to be tossed. "No," she said. He laughed the way one laughs at a wind-up toy. "You do. Everyone does. Let's make her play. Wouldn't that be hilarious? For the benefit, of course." Laughter slid like a pebble across the salon. Whoever's brave enough to force a poor seamstress onto the Mercer piano. "It's a Steinway," someone corrected, appraisingly. "From Vienna. Not a Steinway." It mattered, in the house of people who counted the provenance of their things. Marcus's lips widened. "Right. A Steinway. Perfect. She will." He glanced at Amira with a grin that had never had use for humility. "She'll play us some peasant's lullaby." There was a kind of silence in the salon that had nothing to do with the piano. For a moment Amira thought of walking out of the small rooms she left each night, humming notes under her breath that no one would ever know. But the dress she held was still only half mended, and 3 weeks' wages anchored her like an iron. So she stayed. The Mosses liked their entertainment to be sudden and photogenic. A man pulled from a poker game to recite the Declaration of Independence, a violinist to play a practiced encore. Marcus crossed the room as if choosing a game, and in a flourish that owned grateful upper lip twitches, he swept off a silk cover and revealed the Steinway. It was not merely an instrument, it was a judge. The lid rose like the drawn eyelid of a god. "Come," he said, and his voice was a small whip. Cameras, phones, really, but all lined with expectation, turned toward her like sunflowers at an eclipse. Lydia Mercer, the hostess with a laugh that plated compassion over cruelty, clapped once and said, "A charming idea." Her hands were warm, her words were colder. "Oh, do show us. For charity." People cheered, the sound and netting of small cruelties. Amira could smell the perfume, the citrus and vanilla and the expensive kind of fey. She had been mocked for her clothes, for her accent, for the way her knuckles were calloused. She had learned to keep the quiet that guarded her small life. Yet something in her, the stubbornness sewn into her upbringing, the memory of a man who taught her to find in a fifth the sun's particular angle, stood straight like a chord being struck. She crossed to the piano with the hem of the dress tucked under her arm. The keys were cold under her fingers but familiar. Her left hand found middle, see as one reaches for the edge of a familiar table in the dark. She had never performed in front of people like this, had never worn a gown that belonged to another woman, never sat where chandeliers divined the air so precisely. The salon exhaled anticipation, like a theater before the curtains opened. "Play something pretty," Marcus said. "Make us laugh." The first notes escaped like a breath off one of the market rooftops. They were not pretty in the way the party expected. They were honest, a slow arpeggio like rain finding gutters, then a soft melody that tracked small things, the hum of an oven, the knowing of a bell. Amira's hands remembered the hours, a Sunday morning, a tiny radio playing something classical while her neighbor sliced bread. The way Mr. Kadim would say, "Don't chase the notes, Amira. Let them meet you." She let them meet her. She began with a piece she did not know the name of. It was a melody composed from the scraps of lullabies and hymns and market songs stitched together in the quiet of her kitchen. The notes were simple, but they carried an old room in them. And slowly, in the manner of flame licking through oil, the room changed. First, the laughter softened. One by one, people took their hands from their glasses. A woman in Arctic fox looked away, and in the angle of her elbow there was the shadow of a child she'd once lost and refused to name. A man with a new marriage ring swallowed. Lydia's laugh faded like a radio being turned low. She was holding a fork suspended like a question mark. Marcus's smile, which had been a blade disguised as chirp, found itself dull and misplaced. Amira closed her eyes. The piano was a language she never needed to translate. She thought of sewing, how a pattern must be observed and then adapted, how one wrong stitch could tear the intention, and how music was an embroidery of time. Her fingers moved like the needle, up, down, pull taut, secure. The room grew quieter not because it was instructed, but because the music had asked it to. Someone coughed, small and unnecessary. The cough sounded like a confession. The merchant from the corner of the room, a businessman with a wallet for a face, straightened, then slumped, his face rearranged into something that looked like grief turned thin. At the back, an elderly woman pressed her hands to her chest. Beneath the jewels, there were veins like the tracks of a map. Amira kept playing. The piece bent and rose and became a narrative. The ache of leaving home, the awkward exhilaration of a first secret triumph, the old stubbornness that refuses to bow. It had no title, but it held stories. People began to remember things they had told themselves they had forgotten. Amira thought of the nights she had slept with the smell of her mending pinned like a map to the pillow. She thought of Mr. Kadim teaching her the idea of silence between notes. "It's where the music breathes," he used to say. She breathed. The music that came out was not technically immaculate. There were small imprecisions, little hesitations that made it human. For some of the richest people in the room, it was the first true encounter with anything unrefined since their childhoods. Lydia shifted, as if hearing the music through the barrier of propriety that she'd erected between herself and anything messy. Her hands tightened on her clutch. Once, years ago, before she learned the economy of smiles, Lydia had lost a boy to an illness the doctors could not be bothered to forgive. That loss sat behind her throat like a grain of rice. She had learned to build celebrations enormous enough to bury the ache. Amira's music dug like a gentle tool and found the grain. Lydia's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Her color changed to the color of someone who had realized she had been watching the wrong person all her life. Marcus's face reddened, not from shame but from the shock of being confronted with the effect of his cruelty. He watched his friends watch Amira, saw the way the room humbled like paper under rain. For a moment, his world, one of taunts and borrowed applause, found itself with no foothold. He reached for the joke, for the laughter, but the laughter had turned to reverence, and he could not replicate it. At the far side of the room, a young man, a guest who had been laughing at a story about yachts, pressed his forehead into his palm. Something in his jaw uncoiled. Tears rose in his eyes, quick and private. A violinist in the corner, hired for the evening, put down his glass and let his fingers dangle at his sides, unharnessing the professional part of himself to simply listen. For all the wealth around that piano, the room had become a place of mourning and revelation. The music made them small and then honest. Amira did not think of those people as wealthy or poor while she played. They were listeners, like the taxi drivers on the street who had once tipped her coins for mending a torn coat, like the child who had smiled at her from a shop window because she had whistled a tune. In the sanctuary of sound, there was only the thread that stitched people together: loss, hope, small mercies. Her breath measured the phrases. The notes were unadorned, but they were true. At one point she stopped, and a silence rolled over the salon like a tide. A hand reached for the top of the piano. Not Marcus's this time. It was Mr. Kadim, who had somehow arrived at the Mercer Gala as a shadow in the doorway. He wore a coat that had seen seasons, but his eyes were intact with pride. He did not clap. The kind of pride he felt was not the need to perform. He just looked at Amira, and in the way he looked, years of patience in a small studio with a broken radiator converged. It was not the approval of the rich that mattered. It was the recognition of a teacher who had given a young woman something no money could buy. When the final notes dwindled into the room like the last embers of a fire, the first sound that arrived was not mockery or applause but an intake of breath, a collective, involuntary acknowledgement. Then the applause came, tentative as a sunrise. It grew, complex and awkward, because these people did not often know what to do when they met authenticity that was not being sold. Lydia stood slowly, her perfume a kind of apology in the air. Marcus, red-faced and small, did not clap. He smirked first. The smirk faltered, then dissolved into silence. "Bravo," Lydia said finally, the syllable wet with something she could no longer conceal. It was not quite praise, it was raw recognition. That was unexpected. She looked as if she had been given a mirror and did not like the face it showed her. "It was beautiful," Mr. Kadim said. His voice had a rasp, the sound of someone who had smoked his silence for years. He stepped forward and placed a thin, nervous hand on Amira's shoulder. "Your timing, your listening. You have given them a gift." A younger woman in a simple frock, a friend Amira recognized from the tailoring house, pushed through the crowd, her cheeks wet. She grabbed Amira's hands and said, "You are incredible." The two of them laughed in a small, choking way like people who had shared a secret. People offered condolences in awkward threads. A banker offered an envelope. Someone else offered a private lesson, as if Amira were a commodity to be traded. A magazine journalist rifled a notebook for a headline. A socialite suggested a grand performance that would surely translate into charitable donations and favorable photography. The room, hungry for meaning, sought to label the moment. Marcus found his voice at last, the way someone finds a key that has been lost under a mattress. "You were lucky," he said, and his tone was an attempt at magnanimity. "Most people don't have that." It was meant to be a compliment. Amira felt its edges, sharp and insensate. Luck. It was a small, dangerous word. She thought of nights in which luck was an empty pocket and stubbornness was a plan. She thought of Mr. Kadim teaching her to keep her wrists loose, to let melody breathe. She had been lucky in the way a seed is lucky to find a crack in the pavement, not by favor but by need. "Thank you," she said to the crowd, and her voice surprised her by being steady. She could have accepted the envelope or the offers of professional polish. She could have used the attention to buy more thread, more food, a better room. But as she sat with the applause settling around her like dust, she understood something in the shape of the night. To accept being paraded as a curiosity would be to fold herself back into the life she had and to let others decide her worth. "So," Lydia said, smoothing air that seemed to be creased by guilt. "Would you?" Her sentence could have been an offer or a request. It smelled faintly of rescue and the more intoxicating scent of control. Amira smiled, a thing of careful economy. "No," she said. The word landed differently than Lydia expected. The room waited for a second show of humility. Amira lifted her hands and smoothed the silk of the dress over the piano lid. "Music has been my refuge," she said softly. "I do not play for prizes nor for spectacles. I learned to play because I loved the sounds. I sold no apples to buy a violin. I will not become someone's novelty." Lydia's face hardened for a fraction of a second, then softened into the kind of contrite regret that never quite reaches the heart. "But," she began. "But thank you for the invitation," Amira interrupted gently. She stood, fingers finding the hem of the dress again, and returned to her work like a person who had been given a glimpse of another life and then decided the one she had would be transformed, not traded. There was a dignity in her refusal that both annoyed and humbled Lydia, and it made her older in the room's eyes because dignity ages the impatient. Outside the salon, the city was the same city. Taxes argued. A stray dog barked at a billboard. A man with a cracked briefcase laughed at a joke his phone had sent. Inside, some of the guests lingered, stunned into small truths. Others rose like a tide and retreated to darker parts of the mansion, their laughter finding old grooves again. Marcus hovered, a child who had reached for something he could not own. It was not long before the tabloids decided what the night meant. Photos of Amira's hands at the Steinway spread like varnish. Someone wrote a piece about how the underclass could entertain the upper crust, and another argued that the Moses had been charitable to include such local color in their evening. Emails fluttered into Amira's small world like moths. Offers, invitations, a prestigious conservatory. Each one came dressed as possibility. People imagined that the seamstress would be swept into a life of lessons and recitals. They imagined that the music would be a bridge to something grander. They missed the quiet fact that a bridge can be crossed without leaving home. Mr. Kadim was already smiling in the way that suggested 1,000 small victories. He took Amira's hand and said nothing at all. The day after the gala, Amira went back to the tailoring house at dawn. The room smelled like starch and loyalty. She folded a shirt with the care of the woman who knew what each stitch would do. She had a new thread, finer than the rest, purchased with the money Lydia insisted on sending as gratitude. Amira accepted the thread and knotted it in a drawer. She sat with it for a long time in the quiet of the morning, thinking of the offers that had come like birds. That afternoon, a letter arrived bearing a wax seal she recognized. It was from a conservatory in the city center. Of course, they wanted her to perform, to train, to refine. The letter spoke of talent and cultural enrichment and scholarships. For a moment she read it as if it were a translation of everything she had never spoken. The impulse to accept was ferocious. It hissed with possibility, security, light, steady piano benches where she would not have to sit at the edge, hungry for practice. But she also thought of the child who had once peered into her shop because she had hummed a song. She thought of the old woman who bought a pair of socks from her and wept because the socks fit perfectly for the first time in years. The music had made the Mercer's salon stop and notice the smallness of their own lives. It had been a lens, not a ticket. To accept a life where she would be shown off like an acquired pet felt like permission for someone else to place her inside a gilded cage. Mr. Kadim did not push. He had taught her how to sit, how to breathe, the algebra of chords, all the things that made music a sustainable life. But he also taught her something else, that dignity was a composition, and its rests were as important as its phrases. "I will teach," Amira told him finally, and the words surprised them both by how full they were. "Not because they will know my name, but because the hands that will learn will be small and often hungry. I will teach in the neighborhood. I will take a batty keyboard, if I must. I will teach those who cannot pay now, but who will carry music in their pockets like coins. She thought of Marcus again, of his careless laugh. She did not wish him pain. Her refusal was not a punishment so much as an offering. To choose where one's gifts go is sometimes the only sanctity left to a person in a world that trafficked in exposures. Amira would not let her playing be a lamp that only burned for the wealthy. She had learned the lesson in a tin-roofed room, where the city thundered. The music that silenced the Mosa salon had been born of lack. It must, like kindness, return. Years later, people at parties would speak of Amira in the way one speaks of a myth. Do you remember the seamstress who played at the Massa? She refused their offers. She chose to teach. That reframing made the Mosa guests uncomfortable, because myth does not like to sit on velvet. But for the people in the neighborhood, Amira became the woman whose hands taught other hands the names of notes, who could make a moth-eaten keyboard sing like an instrument of the gods. Children who could not afford shoes sat on crates to reach the pedals. A boy who had been a car wash helper learned to play a Bach chorale and later taught a scholarship student who would in turn teach another. As for Lydia, the concert that evening lodged in her like a stone. For a long time afterward she found herself quiet in the middle of parties, listening harder. She began to visit small clinics, donate anonymously, and sometimes, always at night, back in her large bed, she would reach for a photograph, press her fingers to the back, and allow memory to unstick like old paint. Marcus, who had been taught that power was amusement, went to war with boredom in other ways. He apologized to Amira once in a note that smelled faintly of cologne, but the apology wanted to be a purchase. Amira refused it with the simple modesty of someone who knew that repair was not always for sale. It cost Marcus more than he liked to admit, because his father's world was currency and parades, and having them fail to impress was an odd sort of poverty. There were nights when the gallery owners called and offered to sell Amira to the right patrons, and she always declined. She accepted instead the small requests, a neighbor's wedding, a child's first recital, a memorial for a man who had been a baker and remembered only in the smell of bread. Her playing remained unvarnished. People traveled for miles to hear a woman who had once been a seamstress play with a kind of intimacy that required no program notes. On one rainy afternoon, years after the Mosa Gala, a gallery opened a show in which a photograph of Amira's hands at the Steinway rested in a gilded frame. The caption read, "The night that silenced a room." People queued for hours to see the image and read the story. A journalist interviewed her in the corner of the gallery, her fingers stained with dye. She laughed and said, "I was forced to play as joke. I played because I had to breathe." The journalist asked, "Do you regret refusing the conservatory?" Amira put her hands on her lap and looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. "I regret nothing," she said. "You can build yourself a life by accepting applause. Or you can build it by training other hands to find the notes that will sing for them. I chose the latter. I knew the music would find its way." The story of the night did not end in simple victory or in any miraculous reversal. There was no sudden flurry of invitations to mansions. There was, instead, a quieter revolution. The neighborhood piano room, where children learned to count rests like promises. The small concerts in a community hall where the chandelier might have been a bare bulb, but the audience listened like a congregation. Amira taught them patience and the beauty of small corrections. She taught them that the world might try to force you into a show, but you could always insist on being an artist in your own life. On the 15th anniversary of the gala, Marcus wandered by the community hall, because curiosity is sometimes a newer, less honorable cousin of humility. He listened from the doorway as a child played a slow piece, fingers trembling. The melody was the one he had heard at the Mosa salon so many years ago, the one that had made his laugh leave him like an ill-fitting coat. He felt something break in him then, not meat and bone but a brittle shell he'd worn with pride. He walked away without applause, without comment, the sort of humility which has no audience. Amira, who sat in the back of the hall, grading the children's fingering like a seamstress inspecting a hem, glanced up and saw him. She nodded once, like one neighbor to another, and then returned to counting the beats. The music filled the hall, small, exact, and defiant, and in it there was room for everyone. The wealthy who had once mocked, the poor who had once been invisible, the children who would one day take hands and teach others. In the end, the joke had been a kind of theft. But underneath the theft was a revelation. that talent and dignity do not belong to any one class, that the power to silence a room grows not from spectacle but from truth. Amira continued to stitch lives together, one lesson at a time, her hands both menders and makers. And sometimes, when the night was quiet and the rain made the windows sing, she would play the piece that had once stopped a ballroom. It required nothing grander than breath and intent. It reminded her, and everyone who listened, that a single honest gift can change the rhythm of many lives. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.